All right, welcome everyone to Inside the Box, which we've titled We Can Do Better for this fall semester 2020. The challenges of the last 7 months made us think about a title that can make us positively move forward. So next slide. This is our inaugural adaptive reuse panel discussion. I'm so excited about this. We're going to have a panel discussion on adaptive reuse every fall, and this is our first one. Next, please. So what is adaptive reuse? It's a complicated question. Next slide. I actually did do a project that I would call an adaptive reuse project, very close to SVA. This is on West 18th Street, and there were 2 carriage houses from 1864 that were for the carriages and the horses that you see here in the street. Next, please. Years later, the building became a roofing company, and it was their office and their storage. They ripped out columns, the floors were sagging, and it was really a mess. Next, please. Then about 3 years ago, I renovated this, and the client really wanted to save the building. So the client spent a lot of money, but the building is back and the street is improved, the structure's all back together. And so it was a carriage house, it became a roofing company, and now it's a restaurant and a bar. So next slide. So when you think about adaptive reuse, there are a lot of other words that get used as well, like alteration, conversion, reconstruction, refurbishment, renewal. It's a very complicated way of taking care of a building, but fortunately we have 3 experts here, Frank Sanchis, Dr. Georgette Grier-Key, and Anne van Ingen, who are going to help us understand this a lot better. Next slide, please. I've been honored to know these 3 experts because I've been a board member at the Preservation League of New York State for several years. They are very important people at the Preservation League of New York State. Frank is the current chair, Anne was the chair for many years, and Georgette and I are on the board. So I am going to hand it over to them. I should also note that there are student scholarships that they give out, so you should really join up. So Frank, I'm going to hand it over to you, and each person will introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about what they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. I appreciate that. And good evening. Well, good morning, everyone. A couple of words about myself. I've been a preservationist now for 50 years. I have spent most of my career in administration working for a series of private and public entities, including the Landmarks Commission in New York City, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which is a nationwide advocacy organization, the Municipal Art Society of New York City, which is a local advocacy organization, and most recently the World Monuments Fund, which is a global preservation organization. So I've had the opportunity through those 4 organizations to really see the breadth of historic preservation and how it affects so many people all around the world. Part of my work has been dealing with projects that included the subject of adaptive reuse, which is what we're addressing tonight. So I'm going to start with 3 sort of big issues to think about. And I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, as I believe we all are, and then hope that you'll have lots of questions during the panel discussion, which is following our presentations. So the building that you're looking at now is the TWA terminal at JFK Airport, which is New York's major airport. It was designed in 1958 by Eero Saarinen, and is considered to be his master work. The question that I want you to think about, and which I hope we can return to later, is should every building be adaptively reused? Is that a universal yes, or are there some buildings that maybe should not? In this case, my opinion was that it should not have been, but I lost the argument. So understanding the extreme significance of this building as an airport structure, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which owns it, had to decide whether to keep it in airport use or not as an airline terminal. They decided that despite its overwhelming significance, it could be used for something else. And so they approved the construction of a big new terminal behind it, which you can see the TWA terminal is the white sort of gull-shaped building with the two tubes coming out of it in the front. And then the large building in the back is the JetBlue terminal at JFK. It was my contention that the experience of going through the TWA terminal to get on an airplane was really a transcendent experience, which was unequaled in the design of any other airport terminal, with only one or two exceptions in the whole world. And that this was so special, and it was such a purpose-built building, that the Port Authority should have made every effort to keep this building as a place where people came to embark upon an airplane. It had a number of features, which I can basically show in this slide. In the center was the terminal itself. The two tubes led to where you got on the airplanes, and that was two structures shaped like your hand, and your fingers would be where you actually walked out and got onto the airplane through a jetway, which was the first jetway that was ever designed for getting on an airplane at this terminal. The idea was that when you walked into the main terminal, you would see the tarmac, you would see the airplanes, and you would progress through the main terminal, which was huge, open, expansive space, through these tiny tubes, which were quite constricted, and then burst into the area where you actually got on your airplane. And the whole experience was very carefully figured out by Eero Saarinen. Well, what happened was that they built a terminal in back of it, but worse, next slide, a hotel was built around the terminal. So now when you walk into the terminal from the front and you look out of it, you no longer see the tarmac. In fact, you no longer see an airplane at all. What you see is the hotel wings, which, as you can see, surround it. And additionally, you have no sense when you're in the building that you're in an airport anymore even, and also you can't see it from the planes because the new buildings completely hide it from the tarmac point of view. Next slide, please. So this view, which was formerly of the airplane that you would be getting on by going through this process, is now staring into somebody's room, and you can see the beds in the hotel right in this picture. I think that a public entity which comes into ownership of an acknowledged architectural masterpiece has to do better. And they need to find a way, in some cases, to preserve original use. Next slide. The second item I wanted to bring on is really very different from that. This is the Woolworth Building in the center of the slide, not the tall building, but the low one to the left. And it faces the Alamo, which is one of the United States' most revered landmarks. And that is the building which is on the right, surrounded by the wall with the arched openings in it. The Alamo was the site of one of a contentious battle in 1836 between the United States and Mexico. The United States was defeated in the battle, but it set the stage for the independence, for the coming to be of the state of Texas, and is known throughout the nation. So the Alamo is one of the most well-known buildings in the United States. The Woolworth Building across the street from it, next slide, is an ordinary but very handsome Woolworth building. This was built in 1916. Woolworth's used to be a popular, inexpensive department store, and there were hundreds of Woolworth buildings all around the United States. This Woolworth building, however, has a distinguished history in civil rights, because in 1960, when there were bloody and vicious fights in the desegregation of lunch counters in the United States, the Woolworth building that you're looking at in March 1960 was the site of the first peaceful desegregation of a lunch counter in the United States. And it was lauded by, among others, President Eisenhower, who was then the president, and Jackie Robinson, who was a very famous African-American baseball player, as an example of how desegregation can, in fact, take place peacefully. So this has a very important civil rights history, which really overrides its significance as a perfectly good historic building. It raises the question of of the need to continue to interpret the original use of a building, if that is a significant use after that building has been adapted for another purpose. And what is going to happen here is that the Alamo has purchased this building and they want to change it into a museum. They were thinking of tearing it down, but it's a perfectly good, sound building. There's no reason to tear this building down. It can really be adapted very well. However, the Alamo has no interest in the civil rights history of the building. So there is a group who is advocating both to save the building, adaptively reuse it as a museum, which makes perfect sense, and in it, interpret its history and civil rights, because the remnants of the lunch counter, which was peacefully desegregated, still exist inside the building. And this is a project I'm working on with World Monuments Fund, and we are supporting the group which is trying to preserve and reuse this building, which is a coalition of groups in San Antonio, in Texas. Next slide. The third question I wanted to raise, which I hope we can get back to, is once the building has been adaptively reused, should or can it be reused again? So you are looking here at the Chinati Foundation. The Chinati Foundation is in Marfa, Texas, on the other end of the state from San Antonio, where the Woolworth Building is. And this is a significant building because it is where the American artist Donald Judd put into practice his theory that art and architecture are inseparable. So thinking about that, the Chinati Foundation purchased a defunct Army military base called the D.A. Russell Army Base. And in that Army base, there were about 20 buildings. And the Chinati Foundation purchased it so that Donald Judd could adapt these buildings to prove his point about the inseparability of art and architecture. Donald Judd chose as the centerpiece of the Chinati Foundation 2 artillery sheds. Now, as you can imagine, an artillery shed is a fairly basic building. So like the Woolworth Building, it was eminently adaptable. My argument here is the TWA building was not, because it was so specially designed. An artillery shed, really, you can do most anything you want with. So Donald Judd hollowed out this building, which I'll show you the exterior of, and he took it right down to its basic structure, which is what you're looking at. He put in windows where there used to be doors that trucks used to pull in. And then he specifically designed this piece, which is called 100 pieces of 100 works of mill aluminum, and installed it in this building. So the relationship between these pieces and the structure of the building is extremely significant. This is exactly the way he designed it and wanted to prove his point. Next slide. Now, from the outside, the artillery sheds, or the brick parts on the bottom, he added the architecture of the curved roofs above. Mind you, Donald Judd was not an architect, he was an artist. But he designed these roofs above because the flat roofs of the artillery sheds were leaking onto his sculpture. So he designed these roofs to seal it all up and created this, which is now the main attraction of the Chinati Foundation, which is an internationally recognized art site. So the question here is, the buildings themselves were easy to adapt. They found an adaptive use through this artist, and he created something really special, which is now known around the world. So you think about, would it be appropriate to adapt these buildings to something else? And I hope we can return to that in our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. We're not going to move to Georgette.
Hello, everybody. My name is Georgette Grier-Key. I'm an executive director of Eastville Community Historical Society in Sag Harbor, New York, and I'm also a board member of the Preservation League. I've been doing this work professionally for 10 years now, and my aspect of it is a little bit different than most people come to preservation. So when I think about preservation, I think about the collective, the story, the collection of, and it's involving community engagement. So when you think about that, I wanted to think about the significance of the persons that may have lived there, their life story. And for us, here is Concert Homestead, which is in Southampton, 51 Pond Lane, if you ever want to Google it. Because when you think about who people are, how they live, how did they inhabit the space, the land, and the actual structure is important to me. Pyrrhus Consul was born technically as an indentured servant into the life of slavery that was tied to his mother's station in life. And his importance has many levels. For one, we have his life story. A lot of times when you hear things about enslaved people, you only hear their first name and maybe not know where they disappeared to, when opportunities opened up, etc. But we have a record for his life from birth to death and the amount of work that he did in the community and how he was revered. He was the whaler, accumulated wealth. He was a contributing member of his society and his church. So that was very important. And these are monuments around the town that represent his life and also where he is finally interred in his resting place. Next slide, please. So that previously on a previous slide was his home. What we say is his homestead, and that's important to us because again, for enslaved, previously formerly enslaved African American to have purchased land and owned land was very important. Where this house is situated, it's considered to be the prime location in Southampton Village. Again, talking about community engagement, I know I don't want to cover some of the questions, but when you think about how to engage in historic preservation and structures, and if you have to tear them down, what that looks like. So the words up there is basically saying that there was a town board meeting And the historical ARB board didn't think it was inappropriate to tear down this house because of the cultural significance of the person that lived there. And then, of course, the owners sued. Not only sued the board as a whole, but each individual person sitting on that board that denied the certificate of appropriateness to tear it down. So after a long fight and still opposition from the community, the board made a deal to let us go in and take the original parts of the house that date back to the 1800s so that we can reconstruct it elsewhere is what our original plan was. So every day I would drive by to see every aspect of the demolishment of the house and cry. But we were able to get the original parts, the timbers that were numbered in Roman numbers. They were hand-hewn timbers. So we made sure we had a lot of the original parts of the house. Next slide. So this here is an example because you saw the other house. Why was this house torn down? And a lot of times these houses that we consider to be a part of the entire American history and the entire story is because it is, but when you see meager structures, you don't pay any attention to the meager structures. So these elements here, I'm sure you're familiar with, which are, traditional architectural design and elements that people normally see. But what about the other people that worked? What about the other people that contribute to society, women, small children, minorities and others? So that's not often considered. So I use this slide as an example to let people understand that there are other things that we must consider. We have here in America, we say her story instead of history, because we believe that a lot of the times the history that was written was about the founding fathers and the people who were important and literate. So we kind of have to look at the other people as well. So I want to make sure that when you're designing your projects, or whether it's archaeology, I work a lot with archaeologists, that you kind of deconstruct the framework that you're used to seeing, because that framework does not always include everyone. For instance, when I work with people with archaeology, I want to see something else other than, yes, we have seen many what we consider to be arrowheads or whatever is important, but when you see a lot of dishes, that can tell a story too, and very well mean the lady of the house was entertaining. So looking at all aspects of the history is what is important to me. Next slide. So what about these structures? What's the significance? And as you begin to think about adaptive reuse, how do you adapt a building that may be an 8x8 room? How do you work with structures that are discarded as not being important or significant? And many of these structures are the structures that I work with, because a lot of the times in telling the history of enslaved people or indigenous people, this is how they normally lived. They lived communal, they lived in structures that they built by their hands with whatever material that they could find at the time. But I also do think that a lot of, like, if you look at the pitch of the roof, that is significant in the period in time. So there are details there that are historically accurate. They are appropriate of the period of the time, but because they look like they're falling down, they're not considered. So all these elements, the materials and everything must be considered. And if they're not considered, we're not inclusive in telling all of the story. So even like this brick, there's writing in the brick. Sometimes I work with some people from the Slave Dwelling Project. And when we go to these historic buildings, we would look at that chimney. Who do you think made and built those bricks? Sometimes it's small children, and you'll see some small handprints in the bricks because children made those. So that's some of the things that we look for. Sometimes we have to just think outside of the box and include all aspects of folklore, tradition, etc. So this is what I want to make sure in my work that is continued to be a part of the vernacular of all of architecture and design, that we make sure that we're teaching this element that sometimes get left out. Next slide. So after it's said and done, and this is the big side of the story, we continue to push. And we have in Southampton, it's called the Community Preservation Fund. And what that is 2% of every real estate sales tax gives us 2%, and we have this fund. So after a hard, long battle, we actually were able to get the town to purchase the property that was previously the site of the Paris Council for about $5.7 million, just the lot. And we had the original timbers, so that was very important to us. And so after we were able to get the town, because the village is the one that tore it down, the town bought it for 5.7, and then the village is now responsible for constructing it. So the actual house itself is really the size of a 2-car garage. I have other issues I can talk to you about, especially designing. You may need to think about prevailing wage. So sometimes that makes the project go a little bit high, but this is what the original structure would look like when we put it back together, which we are working on. Now it's being readapted to a small house museum. So this is the original structure that would be intact. The next slide. So now this shows the design that's going to be readapted for the use of the museum, preserving the actual history. You see the house kind of off by itself, but then it was very important for a community aspect. When I think about what Frank was saying about it has to be in scale with the community, the environment. It should all have a purpose and serve, and at least take a nod back to the original design of the house and taking into consideration everything that's surrounding it. So with this, you see, I'm trying to move my screen, sorry. So all of these elements that you see in this particular design has to do with Paris Council's life. So in the design element, what we have done is we were able to speak with the community, we engage the community, but also what elements of his life will be important to bring back into this house. Another thing for preservation and design with us, when you have something as specific, as significant and historic as this structure, how will it be used? Do we want to overflow of traffic in this space? How will it work with the community? And then the other thing, when you think about it, if you preserve this house intact the way it was, no modern day heating or lighting, or Parks Department love to put bathrooms in these type of situations, that's important to us. But also making sure that after we're long and gone, that the community is a building that the community will use, and it'll be used regularly, so we don't have to use another $5.7 million of public money to restore it back to what it was, because now the community has buy-in, they plan to use it. So in thinking about how does the community use it, that's where you come in with the design project, the elements that need to be there, the materials, the cultural significance. So what you see here is Paris Council was on a ship called the Manhattan in 1845. And it was the first time after the embargo, the embargo with Japan, that any Americans were able to get into the port. They actually picked up some shipwrecked whalers, and they wanted to return them to their home, but because of the embargo, they couldn't. They saw Paris Council and they heard his methodical singing voice, as you have it. And so that was taken into consideration. So when you see the people sitting there, that's for the small amphitheater that would be used. So those are the type of elements that we had taken into consideration. Also, he was trusted with the community. So there is this booth over here. Across from his house is Lake Agawam. And he had a CAD ferry boat where he would take the community's children from one shore to the other shore to go to the beach. So that is a way we were also thinking about how to utilize the grounds, the outside, and also keeping the integrity, scale, and scope of his original structure. So every element that you see here is a specific element of design that incorporated his life, materials, and the environment, with the community involved and multiple partnerships between 2 different municipalities. So in thinking about that, that's a lot to work with when you think you're going to come into a project and just be a designer. I think the other skills of working on these multiple levels are very important as well as taking into consideration the actual structure that may not look like a traditional structure that you have seen, and being able to honor that cultural significance, as well as the design aspect and involving the community. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Georgette. Now we're going to move to Anne.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm very glad to be here speaking with all of you. And thank you, Carol, for inviting me to be part of this. It's very exciting. Will quickly run through some slides of a different kind of project, certainly different in scale from what Frank was talking about, and perhaps a little simpler than what Georgette was just speaking about. This was a project that my husband and I did in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina blew through and did so much damage to that extraordinary city. And we were down there at a conference and realized that the city still needed a lot of help. It needed a lot of private investment. We were there about 2.5 years after the hurricane itself, and it still needed an enormous amount of help. So we decided to just buy a small house and fix it up. So buy a wreck and fix it up. So the next slide, please. So here it is. This is 5516 Dauphine, which is the street address, and it is a single shotgun, and it was built in about 1870. Ignore those columns there. They were put on a lot later. This was built in about 1870. It's a very, very traditional New Orleans and actually tropical building form. It's a series of 5 rooms. You'll see when I show you the floor plan, 5 rooms stacked end to end with a corridor down the side. And it's only about 16 feet wide. The whole building is about 60 feet long. It's raised up on piers, as you can see. It is an extremely simple house. It's got high ceilings, about 14 feet. And the form came from Africa to Haiti. It was a traditional African design, went to Haiti with the enslaved people who were taken to Haiti. And then after the Haitian Revolution in 1809, free people of color brought this building tradition to New Orleans, where it flourished. It's a very good building type for this city. So next slide, please. So this is in the lower 9th Ward. This is 2.5 years after the hurricane. The building had been empty when the hurricane struck and then obviously abandoned. We bought it for a song, and the idea was to renovate it, get the lights on, sell it or at cost, with a lot of volunteer labor. The idea was just to get an affordable piece of housing back on the market in this very damaged neighborhood. This is the lower 9th Ward, which is the neighborhood in New Orleans that suffered the most amount of damage from that storm, that hurricane. So next slide, please. So this is Wes, my husband, pointing. You can see in that slide, there's a line of grass clippings. That was the height of the floodwaters. So the floor of the building is about 3 feet off the ground, and then that's about another 4 feet up. So it was about 7.5 feet of water that it sat in for only actually about 4 days. Next slide, please. And this is the east side after we took off that damaged siding. And what you can see here was really an interesting thing that we discovered when we started dealing with this building, which was a little bit scary. This is a completely foreign structural system to those of us who've worked in the Northeast all these years. And I should have said before that, sorry, before I jumped in with my exciting project, I have been a preservationist for decades. I was actually a student of Frank's at Columbia University. And again, like Frank, I worked in administration for many years. I worked for New York State. I was a funder. I was funding preservation projects around the state. When this project came along, I decided it was time to jump in and get some creds and actually do a project and get my hands dirty. So we bought this project and launched in. What you're looking at are these vertical boards or barge boards. This is heart pine that was used to build barges, to carry consumer goods down the Mississippi to the Atlantic. And they would go down the Mississippi and end up at New Orleans, the port of New Orleans. They'd offload whatever they were bringing down, grain, corn, lumber, whatever. And then the barges would be knocked apart. They would be taken apart because it was too much trouble to drag it back upstream 1,000 miles back up to the northern part of this country. And those boards were reused in these buildings. So those are vertical barge boards that started off life as boat building material, which is actually sort of an interesting story about this whole house. The structural system was very important to understand. Our neighbors got busy doing demolition about the same time we were, and the house collapsed because they didn't understand the structural system. There are no corner posts. The interior, you can see the horizontal boards inside, those are interior planking that basically stiffened the building. And then there are interior partitions that braced it. But it's it's a very simple, very strange structural system, which we quickly had to figure out. Next slide, please. So this is the bathroom as we found it. It was really revolting. This is the 5th room back. If you start at the front of the building, count 5 rooms back. This was added on later. It was disgusting. Next slide, please. This is what we did on Christmas Eve, 2008. We had to do mold remediation. You can see to the right of Wes, you can see I'm standing at the front door, and you can look right down the length of the house to the back door, where the back door is open. And it's called a shotgun because the theory, the legend is you could stand in the front door and shoot a gun, and the bullet would go right through the house and out the back door without hitting a wall. So it's a shotgun house. That's why it's called that. So this is all volunteer. So that's what Wes did on Christmas Eve. So the next slide, please. The structural work had to be done, another volunteer. This is our great friend, Joe Loya. 3 of us ran this project. And so we had to rebuild the sill at the northeast. You can see the cribbing down the lower right corner. The ground is really unstable in this part of New Orleans. It's about 4 feet below sea level, and it shifts and it moves. And amazingly, the structural system of this building allows that to happen, which is sort of surprising, but it did need to be shored up. Next slide is a portrait of myself. There you are. This is what people do when they take on projects. I think I was stripping paint, which probably had lead in it. So we were trying to be a little bit careful. Next slide. The idea was to bring a lot of friends, a lot of relatives, college friends, an old boyfriend and his family. The whole labor was volunteer. We did actually hire out the trades. We hired licensed plumbers and electricians, but pretty much everything was done by volunteers. The idea was to keep the cost of this project really low so we could sell it to somebody at a very, very low price. That was the whole goal. Okay, so next slide, please. This is me and Wes bossing people around. You get a sense of the condition of the neighborhood behind us, largely abandoned. There were only 3 occupied houses on our block when we started this project. One of the hopes of this project was that by getting this one back up online, other people would jump in, other property owners would jump in and renovate their buildings. And that actually is what happened. So now on that block, it is pretty much fully occupied and renovated. It has taken a long time. The hurricane was in 2005. We did this project in 2008 and 9. And there is still work to be done. So next project, or next slide, please. A lot of what we did, we used a lot of salvage. We didn't buy a lot of new stuff. That was part of the goal of the project. And at the time, right after the hurricane, there were a couple of architectural parts warehouses that were established by nonprofits. And this was a particularly good salvage yard. The larger of those 2 doors became our front door because the doors had been stolen after the storm. And then the white door between Wes and Joe is, we put in a wall for a bedroom. It's for a bedroom door. And that was, I think, the bedroom door. Anyway, so we bought a lot of trim, stuff like fireplace surrounds. Materials had been stolen out of these buildings right after the storm. So we went to the warehouses and salvage warehouses and bought reclaimed architectural parts, including barge board. There was a supply of barge board, which was pretty extraordinary. Okay, next slide. The kitchen now is coming along, almost done. I blush to admit we went to Lowe's to buy the appliances and the counters. We figured we were going to be selling this to a 21st century family. They didn't want to live in a 19th century house. They wanted a real kitchen. They were going to want a real bathroom. So that's what they got. So this is almost done. And that dishwasher there in the middle was actually donated to us. So next slide is the bathroom, getting some fine tiling done. So that's coming along nicely. Next slide. These are the floors. Amazingly, those are the original floors of the house. And they did not, when the house sat in water for 4 days, they did not flood or did not buckle. And that's because there was no subfloor. So when the flood water receded, it just washed out and the floor didn't buckle, didn't swell. It was really quite extraordinary. So all we had to do was clean the mud off. You're looking at mud there basically, and then refinish them. And again, you can see the shotgun effect, and you can see we've replaced the sheetrock, kept the trim as much as possible. We kept all original trim, wainscoting, all of that. And all the windows, amazingly, all the windows are original. There was not a pane of glass broken in the hurricane, which is remarkable. largely because the shutters, the house had a full suite of shutters, which we were able to get back. And those shutters protected the windows from the storm. So next slide. So there's the finished floors. You're starting to see interior finishes. Next slide. And this is a fireplace surround that we got at one of the salvage warehouses. If you go back one slide, if you could, for just 1 second, you get a sense of how high these ceilings are. And the reason they're so high is it allows, as you all know, I'm sure, hot air rises. There's no air conditioning in these houses. So in the hot summer days, the hot air rises, and then kind of there are fans in the ceilings, just big old fans. And the original fans still worked because the floodwater didn't go that high, and we just kept them. And that moved the air around enough to keep the houses cool. It was really quite extraordinary. This was about 10 degrees cooler inside this house on any day in August than it was outside. It was remarkable. So this is a house that was built for its climate. It's perfectly situated to its climate, which is one of the things that, as you're working with historic interiors and reclaiming old buildings, is understanding how they sit in their landscape, how they sit on their site, how they respond to their environment, their microenvironment is all crucial to make a project successful. Okay, so next slide. Again, that's that fireplace surround in the front room. And then the next slide, give a sense of the floor plans. So these are 3 versions of the same floor plan. So moving plan A is essentially what we ended up doing. So as you're seeing, you see the front is a bedroom. Well, the red lines are the only pieces of architecture or walls we installed. So if you look at it traditionally, there are no wall. You walk from one room to the next, to the next, to the next. There's no privacy in these houses. So we took the largest room, which is the second room, and made that the bedroom. And because it was so big, we could actually then put in that wall you see there running parallel to the outside walls and create a closet. That made it a private bedroom, which this building never had. There was a fan in the middle of that room, and there was a long conversation about whether or not we were going to move the fan, ceiling fan, so that it would then be centered in the middle of that bedroom. Wes wanted it to remain in the middle of the original volume because that would tell the story that the wall was new. I thought that was a little absurd, but he won that argument. So the fan is off center in that room. It still works fine, but it tells the story of that room. And then you go into the living room. The kitchen is in the original spot. And then the back room, the last room down at the bottom of the image, was completely decrepit. That's where the bathroom was. That got completely gutted. Perhaps we would have taken that room off completely because it was added later. We probably would have saved some time and energy, but we didn't. So the other 2 floor plans show some iterations. We ended up doing a very simple scheme. A is essentially what we did, and we put in a couple of closets and kept it very straightforward. So the next slide there's the finished house with our great friend Dolores, who lived next door, and Wes. This is about a year after we finished. And then the final slide is the house for sale. And we actually did sell it. Took a couple years to sell, but we did. And it has done exactly what we wanted, which was provide a nice piece of affordable housing in a neighborhood that really needed the help. And we learned a lot from this, and we can talk about some more of these issues revolving around preservation and adaptive use and the things you need to think about when you're taking on a project like this. So I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. So now we can all put our faces up. You are all my heroes. I am telling you, I just learned so much, and I'm so proud of all of you for all the amazing work you're doing. I'm excited that you just shared that with our students. It's just amazing. So applause already for that. Now, as an interior designer, I often enter places that kind of look like that bathroom in Anne's project. Very often, like 80% of the time. And you stand there and you think, how am I going to make something out of this? How am I going to transform it? Or a big question is, how do you continue to do projects that are green, which is something that we all need to do when you have old structures? You might have lead paint, as Anne showed. How do you do a green project under those conditions? And then I will add, we all have energy codes nowadays that we have to respect, or your project they won't allow it to open. How do you deal with that? So that's open to any three of you, any one of you.
Well, let me just jump in for one, just right off the bat. I think preservation is by its very nature green, right? The most sustainable building, the greenest building is the one that already exists, period. So just, it's, you have to think of the two things as the same, essentially the same approach to life. You're reusing something that's perfectly good. You're making sure that all those building materials don't go to the landfill. You are respecting the building, as I said, in its site. You're understanding how it works with its local climate, and those are all sustainable green issues. And preservation is exactly that. And for whatever peculiar reason, because we've been thinking this way, preservationists have been doing this, writing about this, thinking about this for 100 years. And for whatever reason, we didn't seem to quite grab that message and run with it ourselves. It got taken over by sort of the sustainable crowd, when in fact, we're all doing the same thing. And I think that's really important to understand, that this is sustainable design.
Well, that's an interesting point, Anne, about what you're talking about, because that is what Donald Judd really wanted to achieve in the building in Texas at Marfa, at the Chinati Foundation. But it didn't exactly work out that way. And I think that's a challenge for designers, because the temperatures in Texas are extreme. It drops down to 0 on a cold day in the winter, and it goes up to 120 on a hot day in the summer. And yet, Judd wanted those buildings to be as natural as possible. So he didn't put in any ventilation system he didn't put any ventilation system in. He was thinking of putting one up in the top, in the curved roof that he built, but then he decided that would make too much noise, and he wanted you to view his structure, his artwork, so that you could hear a cricket outside. So he didn't want to have a fan because that would make it too noisy. He didn't want to control the temperature inside because that would be unnatural. So the result of that was that those sculptures expand and contract so much that they actually move across the floor as they expand and contract, which destroyed the idea of them being perfectly lined up with the columns and the windows and the joints in the floor exactly the way he wanted them to be. So curatorially speaking, going forward, now that the Chinati Foundation is tasked with preserving these works of art in situ, it leaves them with a little bit of a problem, because to be true to Judd's vision, they cannot air condition the building, they can't climate control it, they can't put in a fan, they can't do anything, in fact. And so the whole approach there is strictly to make the building water resistant, because he didn't design decent drainage systems or anything, so it leaks, and to prevent rodents from getting in and making nests in the sculpture. That's about it.
That's a lot, Frank, but oh, wow. For me, I think there are ways to do it. A lot of the times, this is one of the points of making sure that a lot of the times you see historic buildings or a museum that has never changed for the last 30 years, right? So why would anybody go back to visit it? Because it's the same. So I always focus on the fact that how will the community and the people engage with it, much like Anne's property that somebody did move in. So there's an intended use. So of course, following the Secretary of the Interior standards, they have standards for everything, for sustainability, for reconstruction, rehabilitation. So first, looking at those standards is the one thing that I would look at and make sure that we're able to do it. I think now in this time where we are is readaptive use good for everyone? It's not a one size fit all, but I think there are technologies, materials that focus on efficiency that you can use that sustainable over time, and not for a frame particular example, but there have been difficult structures where we had to be creative and going through the floor because you don't want to have something being built out in the front that completely changes the look of the outside structure. And I think one of the things, even in regards to paint, there is sustainable paint that you can use the historical colors, but it's not odorous, no lead. There's other materials, we don't want to, in preservation, design something that looks as a carbon copy, but how does it use and work together? So there are materials, whether it's windows, clapboards, furniture, that you can use that are more sustainable. And eventually, how do you use the building effectively? Some buildings don't have handicap accessibility. And not even just a ramp, the doors need to be widened, the cabinets need to be lowered. So taking all of that stuff into consideration, there are standards and ways that you can do it. Not saying that it's the most cost effective for a lot of projects, but in what Ann was saying, the reuse and purpose. When you reuse old buildings that were no longer used, to tear it down, that's a lot of pollution. If you save the buildings, you now have other materials that you can use. And God forbid, if you do have to tear it down, maybe it's a way to recycle it on site to put it back in the site. So we're not, using new materials, tearing down new trees or whatever it is to now put it back in. So I think that sometimes it works where it can be sustainable and it works, and then sometimes it's not. But at least looking at the options that you have, I think is important.
Wow, all great answers. I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. Since we started a little late and I know our students always ask good questions. Adaptive reuse, it seems, could be used for a historically significant building, but it could also be used for a building that's not so significant historically, which then I would say that's historic preservation. Can you talk a little bit about that, the difference, I guess? I mean, someone might say, well, this isn't worth saving, it's not significant, but yet it is worth saving because you just explained that you're saving materials and you're being green by doing that. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, for me, it depends on the situation. So in historic preservation, the first thing that I would do, if there's no local ordinance, meaning your local government doesn't have an ordinance where you can't tear it down, that's one set of rules that you have to look at and make sure that, there are guidelines, that they have design guidelines along. Sometimes local ordinances have their own guidelines. I do think for something that is not cultural significant, one thing about the codes too that I want to talk about, the governmental codes. A lot of my fight is always in these codes because it usually says that if anything is architectural significant or culturally significant, a lot of the times they leave out the cultural, and therefore many of the buildings that I work with in communities, they say it's nothing there. Even looking at mid-modern century buildings, nothing is there, but there's a cultural significance that also matters. Even if it wasn't a building, we're talking about things in one community, about the landscape. So technically, a lot of people think of the east end of Long Island as something that has picket fences. Well, there's communities that don't. And the open front landscape is important. So thinking about the aspects that create that sense of community, looking at scale and scope, I think is important as well. And a lot of the times to go in and change some of these structures can be difficult. And then sometimes it's not. But looking at all of the factors that play into a project, I think will ultimately make the decision. And then the funding. As a designer, I know you don't want to think about the funding, but I've worked with some architects and designers who put all of this work into these plans. Then it never happens. It just sits on the shelf. So I think that's one of the things that, if you're working with community groups, you want to say, the level of funding. We have to do funding structures to make sure if we phase it out. is this part phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? So sometimes funding can be an important aspect of the project as well.
I think, and also just quickly, I think there are gradations of significance and importance. But I'm also one who would say that, virtually every building is useful. That it exists, it can be put to some purpose. But of course there are the great monuments. There's the TWA building, which Frank talked about, which is, the extraordinary, the real, pinnacles of architecture and design. Buildings that should be saved as museums. Believe me, not every building should be a museum. We can have that conversation. But then on down to a project like the one we did, which is basically it's one small piece of an intact neighborhood, and it was an important piece, and it was almost more. It wasn't so much it was architecturally significant. It was indeed architecturally interesting, and it told an interesting story. But it was really about the process of doing that project and getting people re-engaged back on that block and in that neighborhood, and getting people understand that there was money coming in and that things were starting to happen and people could safely come back into the neighborhood and, bring their kids and reestablish themselves. And that was as important as I think, doing a great museum restoration. And I would consider it preservation as well.
I would much agree. Georgette raised the significant point that you need to remember is that buildings are significant architecturally or culturally. People long tend to overlook the cultural significance. And whenever you work with a building, you have to take a good look at what you're working with and figure out what is significant about it. I mean,
Right.
Anne's building was you wouldn't realize the way it was designed and why it was designed that way unless you really study the building.
Right.
And so you could easily design something that, oh, I'm going to put air conditioners in and cut the ceiling height in half because it had 14-foot ceilings. But that would be an awful thing to do to that building. Other buildings, like the three that I chose to show you, one was a pinnacle of design building. One was a perfectly good building, the Woolworth Building, nothing wrong with it, but its significance was primarily cultural. And the third one was a building that really had no architectural significance that was turned into something of artistic significance. So when you're approaching something like that, you need to understand what is the most important thing about this building and how do I retain that in my design?